Hey, we're back. I'm Chris. This is Marcus. We're talking fabric pipelines. Today, I understand we're going to be going over variables and for each loops. Is that right, Marcus?
You got it, Chris. How can we leverage variables and for each loops to have a metadata-driven fabric pipeline and really increase our productivity with the pipeline artifacts that we have?
I love it. Let's head over to it.
Let me head over to my screen here. And as always, we'll start on that fabric homepage. And we're going to jump into that data engineering window. And if you followed us for previous videos, we're going to pick up where we left off, where we showed you how to use a copy data test to take blob storage data and put it into our existing Lakehouse resource. So we're going to open up that pipeline, and we're going to dive into how we can leverage variables and a for each activity to divide out the folders and files that we're copying over. So you can see here, I'm starting from that copy data task. But what I'm going to start out doing is in the activities ribbon at the top, I'm going to set a variable. So I'm going to bring that in. But before we can do set variable, we need to define a variable in our pipeline. So with that activity sitting there, I'm going to click that gray space or white space in the background. And I'm going to open the variables tab here in my pipeline. You can see here that I've defined a variable source folder name, and I've made it a type array. You can see if I hit the type drop down, you have three options: string, a Boolean, or an array. In this case, we're going to make it an array. And within that array value, we're going to define all of those subfolders that we want to explicitly pull in from that blob storage account. So I have my 7 subfolders defined in this array. And now I'm going to go back to my set variable task. I'm going to name it set source folder name var to make sure that anybody else coming into this pipeline potentially understands what variable I'm setting there as a best practice. And on the settings tab, I'm going to leave pipeline variable as my variable type. I'm going to select source folder name, and I'm going to copy in that array value that we showed earlier. A little easier to see here with the expanded window. You can see that I have 7 subfolders or folders defined in that variable.
That's fantastic.
So now I'm going to bring in a for each activity. And I'm going to drag the on success arrow to the for each. And within that for each activity, I'm going to define it as for each source folder, because that's the values that I will be looping through for my variable that I just set in the previous activity. In the settings tab, there's a couple of properties to make note of here. The first one is sequential. Now, for this example, I'm going to leave this unchecked, but some considerations you might want to have if you would like to leverage that is if you have an order of operations in the objects or artifacts you're bringing over from your source data. So if you have a file or table dependency where a certain set of files or tables needs to run before the next set, clicking sequential would help you orchestrate that to make sure that the first batch of files would run before the second batch, as an example. In this case, we do not have that requirement, so we're going to leave that unchecked. The next one is batch count. So the default for this is to leave it blank, and that's stating we're going to leave this up to the Fabric pipeline resource to determine what is the correct batch count based on the number of objects I'm bringing over from my source data or in my activities that I'm going to define. So I would advise you to leave that blank to start and see how Fabric determines what is the correct batch count for you to do. If, again, a specific use case here may be I have a for each loop that's going to be running over hundreds of objects. And I've done some testing and debugging and seen that maybe the dynamic batch count is getting throttled in my pipeline. So I may want to explicitly define that by putting something in like 5 or 10 so that the pipeline only runs 10 loops at a time or 5 loops at a time in that for each activity.
I gotcha. What's the items side?
Yeah, Chris, glad you called that out. The items is, as you can see here, the red asterisk. This is something we have to define. And this is going to tell us what we're actually looping through in the for each activity. So I'm going to click add dynamic content here. And it's going to bring open this pipeline expression builder. And we're going to leverage that variable that we set in the previous activity. So I'm going to go to variables and click that source folder name variable and use that as my items definition. Because what this is saying is I'm going to loop through each of the individual folders that I defined in that array variable.
I gotcha.
So now I have my for each activity set for what items I'm going to consume, but now I need to add some activities in that for each activity. So I'm going to actually take this copy data activity that was existing from our previous setup, and I'm going to just use simple cut and paste to move that into my activities window. So instead of needing to drag a whole new copy activity onto my screen, I can leverage existing activities that were either in this pipeline, or I could pull open another pipeline in Fabric and copy between. So a really powerful feature there to leverage existing work. Now with my copy task, there's a couple of changes I'm going to make to the source definition of what was previously defined. So in our previous video, we talked about how to loop through all the files in a broader folder path extension. We're going to make that a little bit more granular here and leverage a wildcard file path. I'm going to go ahead and take part of this, go to wildcard path and select add dynamic content. And before I paste that in, I'm going to add a concat function, which is going to combine a static piece of string with a dynamic piece from our for each loop, a dynamic value. I'm going to start with single quotes and paste in that folder path. Then I'm going to type in a comma, item open and close parentheses. And what that is saying, it's going to take, for each loop that it does, it's going to take the next value in that variable that we've configured. So it's going to loop through and start with folder 1, then folder 2, then folder 3, etc.
Okay.
So I'm going to click OK on that. The next thing I'm going to define in my wildcard path is the file type. So all of these are going to be Parquet files. So I'm going to start with an asterisk for the wildcard. That is the wildcard symbol. Dot. In this case, they are all Parquet. So it's going to be wildcard symbol dot Parquet is going to be the path I want to define for what I want to pull in there.
Okay.
So hopefully I configured that correctly. I'm not going to make any changes to the destination that was previously configured. And I'm going to go back to my main canvas Go back to the home ribbon. I'm going to click Save Quick to save my changes. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit Run.
Gotcha.
I'm going to go to my Output tab. We'll wait for Fabric to generate that output, and there it is in about 16 seconds. It
Yeah, but
completed
did
those
any data load? That looked pretty fast. Are we able to verify that?
Good question, Chris. We don't want to give false hope to people out there thinking that it's this quick, or maybe it is. We'll see. So we're going to step through some of these activities here and just prove out that they were working successfully. So the first one is setting our variable. So I'm going to click the first arrow here and see that the source folder name variable is correctly defining those different tables that I've passed through in that variable array. The next thing is I'm going to click the first arrow on the for each activity. And this is going to tell me that I'm going to do 7 loops because it counted 7 individual objects in that array. So that looks correct to me as well.
Yep.
Now, if I go down and count my copy activities, I can see that 7 separate copy activities occurred, which is matching the items count of 7 that was defined in my for each loop. So far, so good in terms of everything lining up as I would expect. And to look at the first copy activity, as I go through here, unfortunately, I see an error right away in what I defined. So in my wildcard folder path, I forgot to put an additional backslash after full here. So it's actually reading this subfolder as full dimension city, which is not correctly defined. So unfortunately, as I look at my details here, 0 files read, 0 files written. No good. So unfortunately, this was a false positive that, yes, it did succeed, but we didn't copy any data over.
Well, what went wrong?
So I'm going to go back to my copy activity within my for each loop here. And in my wildcard paths, I'm going to add that extra backslash after the word full here to differentiate between my folder name and the rest of the file path. Now, if I go back, I'm going to save that. And hit run again. We'll see if we can actually copy some data this time.
The other time it successfully ran, but because it successfully was defined as a non-file paths, there were no files in that file path because it wasn't a real thing. It successfully did nothing, right?
Exactly right. So always be sure to check, especially in your initial engineering of your pipeline artifacts, to go in and check each of these steps to make sure they're truly succeeding and operating as you believe they should before moving on to adding additional activities.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Marcus. Troubleshoot as you build, right? Or test as you build?
Exactly right. Okay, we have a successful run. However, I'm seeing a failed message here on one of the activities. I'm going to take a look at that. So it looked like we had an error on the sync side based on the details. However, if I look at that table, this was for fact sale set of files. If I go down to the last succeeded, it says fact sale. So because I put on a retry, I was able to get through that error as a best practice, as we called out in one of our previous videos. It automatically continued another run of that same set of files that we wanted to pull in. And if I look at the glasses icon here, I can see that it successfully copied 14 files for that table. So because we implemented that best practice, we were able to get through that error in the pipeline run and successfully load all 7 folders worth of data through a variable and a for each loop in our pipeline. Pretty awesome stuff.
This is fantastic, Marcus. Thank you so much for putting this together and showing us how to do this. What do you got in store for our next video?
In our next video, we're going to take this metadata-driven framework to another level, and we're going to leverage a lakehouse table to pull in that metadata, split out our loads with batches between our dimension tables and then our facts, and even capture pipeline logging information back to our lakehouse. So stay tuned.
I can't wait for it. We'll see you guys next time.